Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Federal Trade Commission settlement and enforcement, real-world impacts on company data retention programs. My name is Priya Keshav, and I'm one of the founders and CEO of Meru Data. Data minimization is an important principle in privacy. While data minimization is simple and easy to understand and somewhat obvious, it's quite difficult to practically implement for various reasons. Just a few years ago, businesses were collecting more information than they needed in the hopes of it being useful in the future. Phrases like data as a new oil was taken quite literally. Organizations started accumulating data for as long as possible because the storage costs kept decreasing. Many felt that the active effort to delete unwanted data was probably not worth the effort. The assumption was that stored data would be useful sometime soon. This resulted in large quantities of unwanted data accumulating in most organizations. As regulators focus on data retention practices, we thought it would be timely to discuss about building data retention programs in-house. We have with us today James Sherer. He's a partner in New York office and co-leads the Emerging Technologies program with Baker Hostetler Digital Assets and Data Management Group. James, do you want to introduce yourself?
You covered most of it there. I'm a partner with Baker Hostetler in New York, and yes, I work with our emerging tech team in the Digital Assets and Data Management Group. And my co-lead on the emerging tech team is our CIO, Catherine Lowry, who handles the internal AI use deployment. My focus is on client inquiries and requests relating to technology.
So, James, should we start by defining what retention means and what a retention schedule is, and then maybe talk about, how traditionally we've sort of approached retention schedules and retention programs versus how privacy laws look at it. So,
Sure. And terminology matters, I think. And that's one of the first things or at least that I have discussions with organizations about. It's like sometimes hey, we have a data governance policy, we have a data retention schedule, we have a records and information management policy, we have a record retention schedule, going through these different issues. Traditionally, a record retention schedule has gone through these line by line categories. Here's a record, and here's how long we keep the record, and maybe sometimes the justification or requirement for it. And oftentimes we've seen that as a floor. We keep this record at least this long. There's a regulatory expectation or requirement that we still have it if a regulator asks for it or a contracting partner or whatever it might be. But it doesn't normally, at least traditional approach, set a ceiling. It doesn't say, okay, well, we keep it at least this long and then immediately get rid of it. It's more, we keep it this long, and if we're like many organizations that struggle with getting rid of information, or information's accumulated or accreted along the course of time, and we don't really know what that information is, then it's more likely than not just going to sit there, or it's going to be up on a file share. And we've seen this as an issue that's grown. I think it's really grown in volume over time. And I will assert part of that is because traditional records practice dealt with paper. And you could see paper, you were forced to interact with it. It's a fire hazard, which is not to say that accumulation of data now is not a risk of a different sort, but it's unlikely to catch on fire. Data centers aside, I suppose. So people aren't tripping over boxes anymore in the same way, although there is a subset of very healthy paper accumulation that's out there that's subject to its own issues that sometimes we help clients with in remediating that. So you've got this idea of records and then minimum retention, but extensions out in two different ways. One is you've got a lot of data now that doesn't necessarily, nor would you want it to qualify as a record. Again, when records were paper, as they were we had cuneiform and then things written in marble and stone. But then once we moved into paper, records are paper, you were intentionally marking things down. Maybe there were notes, maybe even memos to file could become records. Everything was intentional. You were doing something, you were typing something up, you were printing, it was a big deal. So it was a record and it made sense to think of that way. But when it became cheaper and then essentially free to start sending emails, we're collecting a lot of other information that maybe we wouldn't necessarily qualify as a record. So that began, and you might not have everything oriented on a record retention schedule. And likewise, it became just so much easier just to collect and maintain. And there's also some ideas within the InfoGov practice that IT budgets began to increase, and people were less hesitant, or they were hesitant to push back because the more information the organization was growing, then the bigger the IT budgets, and the more they had to look at these things. There is this set off too within legal practice. So at different points in time, there were these questions for, hey, why does it cost so much to maintain information, when organizations finally were turning around and saying, hey, we collected all this stuff and now we've got a legal hold in place and you want us to review everything. And that's just unduly burdensome. And have to explain to courts in the first instance why there's a tremendous difference between the cost of an external hard drive for a terabyte or 20 terabytes and for associated cloud storage of the same amount. Like, it's not apples to oranges, and access and availability of that information isn't the same, but we had this idea in our heads, I think much more pronounced during maybe the last 15 years, that's slowly beginning to fade as people are doing less active NAS storage at home, and now everything is moving to that cloud environment. So again, records, intentional, data management and governance, broader picture, how we maintain that information, and when we should start thinking about getting rid of it. I think it's become a much more complicated picture, and we haven't even gotten into all the different places where data can be stored.
Yeah, and I think part of it was there was this Enron sort of drove this need to make sure that we were not unnecessarily deleting what we needed to keep. And then as e-discovery became expensive, there was definitely a drive to reduce cost of litigation. And also the consensus was that keeping data is not necessarily relevant. So at least those with significant litigation exposure started thinking about defensibly disposing of data as long as they kept what they needed to keep for retention. But then, now we are in a different era where privacy laws kind of define the practice. I mean, and it was always about records and non-records, right? Like, so it was about company information that was being kept. Whereas privacy laws started defining personal information and CCPA in the US, and of course, GDPR is always, data minimization has been an important principle in privacy laws. But in general, the idea of holding personal information only for as long as reasonably necessary and proportionate to the purpose for which it was collected is kind of a new concept. And of course, it doesn't talk about records; it talks about personal information. So, in light of the new requirements, and we'll also talk about security breaches, but how does the definition of a retention schedule more as a documented policy for keeping different types of data, mostly records, kind of evolve to sort of accommodate privacy?
Well, I think I want to be intentional about the terms that we use. So
Yes.
at least when we counsel clients, you can have a record retention schedule, but appreciate that that's what it is. Records defined, minimum capture or maintenance of that information. That's guidance. And that's how we want to apply it, even as like a filter for practice or for operations. Say, okay, well, if this is, and we can take a step back within traditional InfoGov practice there too, and say, that's not to say that we need every copy of the record. Like the record, this idea of a golden record, like this is our source of truth. This is the record we're talking about. Get complicated then. Who maintains it? Is are we using a third party to run our payroll? Are they the source of truth for our records? And what does that mean for our record retention? Now, I have seen some organizations begin to migrate toward an approach that's more data governance, that treats different categories of information according to category. And then you have to make that distinction. So let's just stick with email. That's one we get questions about a lot. How long should I keep an email? Well, I mean, that's like saying that box in the garage or boxes in the garage, how long should I keep them? Kind of depends on what's inside. And when's the last time you opened it up? Have you moved that box with you 3 moves and never opened it up? Maybe it's time to let it go. Does it have the old SCSI cables for your computer, or does it have like childhood memories? I don't know, or some combination thereof. So we can look at that and say, in the absence of a specific record, right, our golden record, it might be an email, and that's the tricky part. Or general requirements like how is the exceptions associated with legal or regulatory hold or investigations or whatever it might be, broker-dealer, investment advisor requirements is like a subset. Taking away those, if we can do addition by subtraction, then we can say, as long as none of these other things are implicated, maybe we're going to treat email as business necessity slash whatever. It's utility for business. It's going to be 3 years or a year or aggressively 30 days. There are different challenges with some of those as you start to winnow it down. But with that, I mean, I think that's the practical way to look at it. And going back to your point about Enron, I mean, that did give us the Supreme Court Arthur Andersen case. It's one of the very few that we have directly on point for record retention. And this idea that absent these other obligations, organizations do have the affirmative opportunity to pick and choose how long they keep things for business purpose. But we want to articulate that there is a business purpose rather than, oh, we just keep everything forever. Because we know that's going to create, it doesn't necessarily create challenges in litigation in the first instance, because you do have a bunch of stuff. There's less, if you have it, when you're asked for it, then you don't have to prove the negative. However, if you have a data security incident and it turns out you have it and there are questions as to why, God forbid you didn't tell people you had it or that you collected it or your notices say something different, then it opens up a wealth of other additional challenges. So I think we're starting to get there where we're setting requirements on these technologies and saying, hey, we'll keep it for X period of time. Then it becomes the complication of, do people feel empowered to either actively delete things or remediate environments, or even to allow the environments to kind of cleanse themselves? The auto delete, the hey, at the end of the calendar year, things will roll off or they'll go into a vault for a little bit and then they'll go away unless people actively select to maintain things.
I'm sorry to kind of ponder a little bit more on this, right? Like, because I think there is a little bit of convergence and a little bit of divergence as well between the two worlds as I see it. So when you look at the world of personal information, in other words, you kind of use a email as an example, but when you kind of look at analytics or data lake or things like that, some of it sort of maybe overlaps with what is a data record and kind of falls within the record retention schedule, but many might be just not related to, not a business record, but just data as defined by us as necessary for business purpose. So you're kind of looking at what is the business reason to keep them. And they probably all fall under the other category in a records retention schedule. So you're looking at it from a perspective of how long do you need it for what you have collected. So does that make sense? And so it kind of becomes a supplement to the records retention schedule rather than part of it.
Well, that's where I think we're going to see if organizations move toward a data retention schedule that has a subset in there for records, but then also gives some guidance for other repositories. And I'm seeing that more frequently, certainly not with every organization. And again, I've got self-selection bias here, depending on who's reaching out to me to talk about benchmarking and an approach. But I do get those questions frequently. How long do I keep email? What are other organizations doing about keeping email? And then, I mean, you walk through the filters there. I mean, do you have records in there? Obviously, this doesn't apply. Do you have legal holds applied? This doesn't, our guidance wouldn't apply given all of those things. Then X approach. And here's where it goes. And if you've got this broader period in mind, we can look to see if that's supported, because that's part of it too. I think if there's, because now you've got different pressures coming in the context of litigation, kind of both ways, especially if you've got asymmetric litigation, where let's say you've got plaintiff's counsel, named plaintiff, proposed class, unlikely they have a lot of information. Well, they want to make sure you have all the information because the more you've got, the more expensive it is to produce, the more likely that that hypothetical smoking gun document is out there. However, if you've gotten rid of the information, then you can make the play about discovery, right? If you don't have the facts, fight the law. If you don't have the law, fight discovery. Claim proof the next. You would have had it, but you got rid of it. And now where is that? You got to prove that this thing never existed that we imagine and assert. There's a subset within regulatory enforcement that has the same thing, like saying, okay, well, we want to know what happened, and we want to know everything about it. So the more information you have, the better, so that we can do our investigation. But they're not investigating privacy issues. They're looking at other things that ostensibly been gone or that have ostensibly gone wrong. Flip over now to privacy enforcement, very different world. Seeing that from GDPR, I think beginning to see it at the US side too, which is something went wrong, and it might have been related to the use of information that you had and you shouldn't have. Maybe you shouldn't have collected it. Maybe you shouldn't have maintained it for this long. Certainly, you shouldn't have maintained it in the way that you maintained it such that something happened. Now the pressure is like, well, other regulators might have wanted you to have all that so they can see what happened. But because you had all of that, you got in trouble. So now we're not only did the bad thing happen, but also the secondary pull away from that is it did it happen because you did this thing, right? You didn't violate and send this information out, but you allowed it to happen because the systems had some compromises and you had the data in there in the first place, and you didn't need that extra copy and we're even using it. So I think there's this wave, and I'm going to assert the one thing that we're starting to confront now is the uses of automated processing AI technologies, starting to actively work with clients, and I'm going to be working with ARMA next week and kind of going through these things and benchmarking. What does it mean for a record retention schedule or a data governance schedule to accommodate for everything associated with AI platforms? The models themselves, the data going into them, the data that's used to modify, to double check, to do all of these different things, and thinking of like those data sets as being part of the tool as opposed to standing alone, and whether like record keeping or data keeping requirements associated with those tools now is going to involve having sufficient information to address questions later on if something goes wrong, but maybe to anonymize or de-identify or to limit the potential security issues associated with those data sets. If they've become records in support of this other initiative, as opposed to your earlier point, just being a data lake filled with a bunch of information that you kept dumping in because we thought there might be a future potential good use for it.
No, yeah, I agree with you. And I think, just looking at just the FTC settlements, in the last year or so, you can see that, pretty much, if you look at Illuminate, they talk about, you talked about the security failures. They had security failures that led to a large amount of student data being breached. And obviously, as part of the order, they sort of said you have to follow the publicly available data retention schedule and make sure the information that is collected is and establish some kind of a time frame for its deletion. If you look at the recent GM order, again, it talks about following the retention schedule and publishing the retention schedule so people know when it'll get deleted. Marriott and Starwood, again, the information security program to help safeguard consumers' personal information, to implement and retain personal information only as long as reasonably necessary, and establish a link on their website for the US customers to request personal information be deleted and provide some kind of a disclosure on when that'll get deleted. So, we can keep going, but like telehealth, Firm, Cerebral, they kind of again bring up the idea of having some kind of a data retention schedule and delete most consumer data, that is being used for treatment payment unless consumers consent to its retention, and keeping it for longer than necessary, right? So it's becoming more and more. And I was just talking about all the FTC enforcements, but if you kind of look at the states too, as the number of privacy sort of enforcements increase, one thing that has been common, and then of course we've seen only, we see the tip of the iceberg in terms of the orders and the actual settlements, but behind the scenes, most of the questions, especially when it comes to deletion and personal information, have also centered around what kind of deletion practices do you have? How long do you keep it? Do you disclose to these consumers that that you keep them for certain purposes for as long as you've kept them, and do you delete them, right? So this is becoming more and more relevant from a privacy standpoint, which is completely at odds with, like you said, the need for us to keep it for litigation, the need for us to keep it to fulfill other obligations. But most of the personal information that sometimes gets collected probably would not be kind of a record, but there is some overlap, with the information that is being stored. So we definitely, as someone looks at retention and deletion and practices, as well as, obviously the most secure thing to do is to get rid of what you don't need, because if you don't have it, then it's not going to get breached. But it's also important, though, to think about, the company's legal obligations, the need for business to keep some portions of the data for various purposes, but the scope of retention and deletion is sort of, should consider some of these, regulatory inquiries as well. So going back to data minimization, right? So what do you think are some of the why is data minimization or retention difficult to implement? I mean, as people have a records program, they kind of talk about minimum data to retain, but most organizations struggle with having, establishing a retention program. So why do you think there are challenges in implementing retention programs?
Well, because it's difficult to categorize information. Like it's an extra step, and people are busy enough with their day to day. It is a compliance exercise, and unless you can demonstrate how data categorization and management will help people in their day to day, I think it's a difficult ask. It's like saying, hey, this cafeteria would be a lot less messy if everybody just kind of pitched in and helped clean up as they go. I mean, that's absolutely true. You probably wouldn't even need janitors if everyone just kind of kept after themselves and pitched in. But we accept that people are doing other things, and the data and systems are there in support of their daily work. And unfortunately, for that particular question, sometimes there's just an economy of scale where you step in and say, you know what, easier to allow things to accrete over time, and then we can handle it responsibly with one fell swoop. And auto classification is still not matured. So to the extent that we're affixing metadata that has operational significance and can apply schedules against it, then it's still to this point science fiction, although I'll say the barriers to some of this are actually more breachable. I shouldn't use that term in a discussion of all of this than other things. I do want to clarify one point, by the way. Not speaking on behalf of clients, not going to name any companies during this on my side. There's plenty of enforcement out there at both the federal and state level for organizations, and that's certainly instructive for current potential clients, regardless, to see where regulators are looking at this and what their sensibilities are about how all these practices work. I think at a practical level, when I'm working with organizations, they want to get rid of information, but it's so difficult to take on that affirmative responsibility internally. So it's easy to collect information. I always work with bad metaphors that I haven't fully thought out, so I'll do one here. I'm going to go back to my garage example and the box of cables. And this is the long running joke. You might have like that box of AV slash computer cables that you don't know if you're going to need again, but boy, you don't want to lose them if you don't, or if you do need it at some point, because then how are you going to find it? You're going to go back eBay, right? There's no more, I don't think there's any more Radio Shacks. Like it's difficult to replicate that connection out or to stand that technology back up or to find that or to pull that picture off the camera or whatever it is. And then the joke was I saw someone post, they're like, hey guys, I finally bit the bullet and I got rid of that box of cables. And he's like, and wouldn't you know it, a week later I needed something from that box. So never get rid of it. Like it's easier in some ways to allow this to collect dust if you need it offhand. And legal professionals are among the worst of the worst. If you're working in this profession, you might want precedent from 10 years ago. Some of the laws don't change. I'll tell you, a lot of the record retention requirements don't change over time, and just enough of them do that to think seriously about evergreening practices. But given that, we've got this, we're academics in this space in large part. And sometimes in those organizations it's the toughest, right? Research scientists never want to get rid of anything. Um, and then we've seen this evolution into big data where there's a claim to your earlier point, like this is the new oil. Well, guess what you don't do with oil? Throw it away before you use it. So like, why not? Maybe some initiative's going to come in and demonstrate the value of this. Now, IBM and others have done these studies that show like rot goes up, the risk goes up, the viability and usefulness of the data goes way down after, I don't know, it's like 48 months or something. And if we're behavioral economists, people change. A lot of your consumers don't stay where they are. But I think that's the challenge. It's too easy to keep. The systems have made it easier to keep. And we don't know if there's value. And then we collect enough of it, organizations, that you don't even know why things are out there. You don't really know necessarily what's inside. We've come up with some tips and tricks, I think, through e-discovery because you're kind of forced to deal with it at that point. And you're going to have somebody on the other side evaluate whether you did it correctly and like challenge everything, even if it's just for the point of challenging it. So in those instances, we've seen we can denist, right? We can go through and get rid of system files. We can check hash values if we're going back to at least the golden record example. We don't need to have every copy. But then we have the question is like, well, but before we get rid of this information, is it important for me to know that X person had access to Y file as part of something that might get challenged? So some of those issues are going to percolate in there as well. And I mean, I and the team and other similar people at different firms, I think have this whole lattice of evaluative criteria that we would assign and say, okay, have we thought about this? Have we thought about this? Have we thought about this? Great, we've gone through this process. Now we're comfortable that instead of opening every box in the garage, you can just load them onto that truck and it can go away. Right? We've checked none of the cables in that box. You don't have any of the stuff they go to. You're not going to need it. And it's very unlikely you're going to buy one of these antiques that would need that cable. You can let it go. But, and if someone else comes back and says later, why don't you have that cable? You can point to the work we did right now. And that can be your proof of the negative. There's no reasonable expectation that we need this stuff. Therefore, we can let it go. But outside of that, organizations just find it so much easier to keep it. Just keep it and maintain it unless and until you have a crisis and you don't want it to go to waste.
So, on that topic, right, we have traditionally talked a lot about this big bucket approach, which is or versus granular approach. And sometimes, at least there was a time when, there was this understanding that the more granular you got, the more difficult it is to solve this problem. So it makes more sense to take a more bigger bucket sort of approach where you define things at a department level or broader categories, knowing that that's not nuanced. But sometimes when you take a big bucket approach, it's easy to define, but it's harder to press the button to actually delete the data because you don't have the details. And sometimes that's where, like you said, being able to prove that these cables are not useful because you don't have the gadgets that use them in the first place, right? Because it looks like a bunch of wires and I may need it. Like, so that's, and it's harder to prove the negative, right? So it's very hard to do that. So, have in your experience dealing with clients, what have you seen as approaches that sort of help in practically sort of solving this big bucket versus granular approach? I have some thoughts too, but I'd like to hear yours and then maybe make some suggestions that I've seen.
Well, I mean, if they've gotten to the point where they're involving me, then they've already committed some resources, which I think is a pretty good sign. And we've got that momentum. Um, I think the debt snowball approach one can work. And that's, I don't know if you're familiar with this, is like a Dave Ramsey personal finance, and I know that's like laden with politics and everything, but just assume here you've got a lot of different debts, a lot of different debts of varying amounts, with varying rates of interest. And let's say you've got a big one with $50,000 at 5% interest, and you've got a smaller one at $2,500 with 3% interest. And you get $2,000, or let's say you get $3,000. You get $3,000, Priya. Where do you apply that between the two debts? The question for you.
Probably the big one, but yeah, hard.
Why would you apply it to the big one?
Uh, because it's, well, I, either way, I pay for, I mean, I think it's maybe the right approach is to look at the cost of servicing those debts and taking the highest risk, right? Like which one poses the highest risk for me. And so that would be my calculation, which is maybe the interest, but maybe also other factors that go beyond the interest. There might be other factors like which one is tax deductible, for example. I mean, I'm just throwing up variables that may not be in your calculus, but might matter for us as you
And
look at.
this is InfoGov. Like this is
Yeah.
this is what gets tricky. But I will say in that particular instance, everything else being equal, you absolutely should pay off $3,000 of the $50,000 loan because that's going to save you money, even though you're paying on the other smaller loan. However, we are still human. We still have cycle. We are still, behavioral economist view. If you want to know what people are going to do, look at what they do. And the snowball idea here is if I get rid of that 2,500 and then pay 500 toward the other thing, I feel more accomplished than knocking $50,000 down to 47. It's just psychology. It is not rational. We're not. We're not rational people. So I try to take some combination of doing the rational thing for the organization while ticking the boxes of those ways in which we still remain human. Because the client needs to see progress because those are their internal initiatives. There's some really interesting things stacked up within InfoGov to where even some of the technologies and providers incentivize you not to do anything over a given quarter or even a given year. It might take actually 3 years to demonstrate ROI if you have to invest money into getting rid of things rather than just staying pat. And that's known within the industry, and that's a challenge because nobody wants to lose their bottom line in a given year if it's bonus criteria rather than kicking it down. Like it's the hurt is a little bit different. So I mean, I look at that. There have been some projects, and I'm not exaggerating, where they would have been solved with kerosene and a match. Have an emergency, have a warehouse fire. That has happened. And one client that lost X period of email. And it didn't end up mattering. Like they worked through it. And maybe there are specific instances that become a little bit more difficult. But I think a lot of the emergencies you wonder about don't happen. Now that said, like within the broker-dealer investment advisor space, you did have regulators going through and the news of one columnist treating that like an ATM. saying it's impossible to do this right, especially because we had COVID, everybody went home, people continued doing business. They used all the platforms they could to make it to tomorrow and to tomorrow. And now we get to look back and judge their behaviors based on, hey, we're requiring people to be in the office with their technologies now. So I think there's a little bit of rose-colored glasses that can lead to some challenges. But I mean, in all candor, I personally, and I think this is true for a lot of the information governance practitioners, we're trying to look at this practically. Say, you collected all this up, you probably don't know a lot of this information. How can I help you build an approach that's going to stand up to scrutiny later on? Because what I want to do is put you in a position where you have to, but maybe not too hard, prove the negative. I want you to be in a position where later on someone will come back and say, hey, what happened to all of this? Because if you're in a position to say, hey, what happened to all of this? It means you did something and you mitigated some of that risk and cost. Or maybe you transform the data. I think this is the brave new world of governance here where we're saying there are different constituencies within the organization that might want that information that we have. We may be running out of good training data on the outside world as AI slop takes over the internet. So we've got all this information internally. Are we sitting on oil? Are we sitting on gold? But how do we handle that responsibly? And is there a step in here for anonymization as part of data governance that will obviate, I would argue, the privacy laws? If it's anonymized data, it doesn't hold true anymore. Now there's some question of data provenance and ownership, which is, again, some interesting brand new questions for a lot of this. But again, all part of the data governance discussion. And I think we're figuring it out as we go.
No, I agree. And I think some things that I have seen, obviously we've talked a lot about the defensible deletion approach, right? Like just like I already have this mountain of data and I need to get rid of it. And taking a risk-based approach and kind of looking at it, makes sense. But as you sort of approach it from a privacy standpoint, if you're trying to kind of implement as you go, the same logic sort of applies too, right? Like, so obviously Google and Amazon and others have sort of established that data sort of is powerful. The more data you have, the more you're able to sort of use it for business, which kind of is important. But at the same time, the privacy regulators have sort of also pushed enough to start to see momentum towards building technologies as you sort of look at newer ways to use data for AI and other purposes where maybe purpose and access is built into the use of data, like how the data kind of moves within the organization, right? There were a lot of conversations about, for example, where data was there and nobody had any controls over who had access to them or how it was being used. And you start to see, larger technology companies sort of reining in on some of that to sort of, you see technical papers coming out to where they're exploring the idea of access restrictions and tying access to purposes and being able to kind of pull data back if need be. Anonymization is another area where there's a lot of technology advancements in terms of how to make it anonymous so that they can continue to use that data. But other smaller things, like you said, paying off smaller, debts make you feel better, but looking at even vendor contracts and establishing, retention timelines as you sort of define new user requirements, right? Like use requirements with various service providers. So there's a lot of things that kind of help in chipping away on a regular basis at data, in terms of paying attention to the retention overall, especially of personal information and sensitive personal information, as regulators kind of focus on this. And so I think you see a lot of that happening, which hopefully, maybe doesn't get rid of the mountains, but hopefully reduces at least reduces the accumulation of data in the future, which, as you said, would be important from a data governance perspective, because if you don't have data governance, it's going to be much harder to sort of use it for AI. And as companies rely more on data for training, they need to be able to do that. Because if you don't have consent and if you have to delete that data in the future, it becomes much harder. It's much easier to kind of know that upfront that you have clean data that is not going to be subject to enforcement before you start training and making that investment from a company standpoint. So there is business advantage to doing cleaning up data as well, right? I don't know what your thoughts are, but yeah.
Well, no, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, we see some of those use cases, although again, are you using the right data to make decisions? Still stuck, I guess, to make it easier to comprehend. So the bad metaphors slash examples. Hey, what about information with intrinsic value that we might want to have on a near permanent basis? But then it can complicate things. So the example is I'm a construction company and I build this complex, and knowing the floor plans and the plot diagrams and all of those things, like I need to know where the underground storage tank is. Right? And I can find that out various ways. I can go and check the source of truth to see where we put it, or I can go dig it up where someone else can find it accidentally. Like we're limited in that. Or we can do expensive soundings or whatever it is. But if we've got the right records, we cut to the chase and we can say we can work around that, or what's inside the walls or whatever it might be. However, I don't want to have multiple copies of iterations of that and not know which one is right. Hey, where did we settle on this? I've got now 2 or 3 different areas. And this is a client not to be named, but I remember a client saying, hey, look at this policy and tell us what we need to change here, especially because it's for our internal audit purposes. And I collected up examples, and I had the version 3, I had the version 3.3, I had the version 4, and it turned out the operative version was 3.3. I don't know how it got forked at some point, and you almost have to be like a forensic analyst to look back at some of this to say, oh, no, this is the operative one. This is what was implemented. This made the decision over here. You can see how tricky that gets. I think a lot of the initial governance isn't necessarily dealing with those edge cases, which, bad facts lead to bad law. Like that's something I've got the story. But it's more, you're trying to deprecate this platform. You're trying to move in a different environment. What can we do basically? Understanding and appreciating that the risk of getting challenged later on is probably pretty low. But I mean, the given risk that your roof is going to light on fire is probably pretty low, but you still have insurance. We think about that, like we're amortizing it across. I think that's why we look at these governance projects and say, okay, well, what is the insurance here? What is the bare minimum? If we're not required by law to do this, and maybe that's part of the privacy sensibilities here, which is we know no one's actively addressing this but for a push. We've seen what's happened already. And unless you actively make money from all of your data, then you're just less incentivized to actively manage it because it's another cost. So how do we get people to pay attention to it outside of when they have to? Can we give credit? Can we give credit for other things you've done in the interim to start to handle these things? Are there commercial pressures? And I deal with the same thing when I'm setting up information governance and AI programs now, which is where people are like, what do I have to do? And it's like, well, here's a subset, or we've got a legal requirement for what it means for an assessment or internal audit or an evaluation of things. But also, this is what we're seeing as a commercial reality right now. So if you want to be positioned to get the contract, to get the work, I feel like I saw this on one of these shorts. Maybe it's like, God bless LinkedIn doing the videos now, but it was someone saying, hey, we're ready to sign the contract. Just want to confirm you guys are SOC 2 compliant, right? And like maybe this becomes part of the narrative, which is other organizations don't want to risk the risk associated with these data collections, or you compiling and maintaining their information, and to start looking more intentionally at what are you doing, what are your representations, what have you been audited against, what kind of certifications or accreditations do you maintain?
No, yeah, I agree. And I think, you like you said, many times, one of the common use cases that you get is I'm coming back to the data lake example, right? Like I have the raw version, I have the cleansed version, and I have now a whole bunch of dashboards and reports that are enriched data that I have sort of maintained. So now I have like maybe five, six, seven copies of the data in the same environment. And then if you look at the usage, maybe the granular information is used for 6 months, but a lot of aggregated information is necessary for 10 years. But having that insight sort of helps you sort of look at, is it worth the risk of keeping, the data beyond the 6 months for the 10 years aggregated, or could you actually remove some of the the identifying data, which makes the data more usable for longer periods, right? And the scrutiny, and it improves security. So as you start looking at business use cases, I think maybe compliance is not the only use case. And once you have removed the identifying data, now you don't have to go through some of the scrutiny. And for compliance, as you're sort of looking at AI, using the data for AI training, right? Like, so it saves a lot of time and effort. So before we used to talk in terms of defensible deletion, just from the perspective of it reduces cost, but now you're able to use the data more freely, which makes for a better business case, I guess, for a retention standpoint, which it's hard to prove, but it's something that you can maybe take as we kind of look at this granular versus big bucket. Maybe, as you said, like, find these nice to have use cases that sort of demonstrate to the company that there is value in looking at retention programs beyond just compliance.
Well, and I wonder, I haven't seen this yet, but a program, well, I mean, I think that's a affirmative defense for some of this would be, hey, we don't necessarily delete this information, but we functionally do, by anonymizing it. So we've changed the character and nature to accept it, arguably from privacy law. I mean, certainly we have that argument within data security incident response. If the information is, it's encrypted in whatever way, then it really hasn't been compromised. You got a copy of something, but you can't get into it. You have a copy of something, but there's just no identifiable information. Uh, and we've seen discussions about that. Like data governance extends out because of all the sharing of information within the commercial picture. Within the AI context related to data use, and again, that governance, like we worked with one client where part of the representations were that the information being acquired through the service was going to be anonymized. And even though they were doing advanced analytics across it and making some automated decision making, they asserted they were anonymizing. And I've given the story before, it's true. A client there opted to bring in a mathematician to confirm and verify approach. It sounded too good to be true, but at the end of the day, the mathematician spoke with the engineers, mapped out what the process was, and this is something that affected a pretty large number of people. And given that, we were able to go back to the contracting picture and refine what the representations were. I mean, we challenged it and got better language rather than attorneys kind of making assumptions. Now, I was working with an associate early today on an AI policy, and the associate saying, "Well, I removed this and this. I'd like to do the addition by subtraction." And I said, "Well, why? Why are you doing that? Are you doing that because you're not aware of them doing it? Are you doing it because you know that they don't do it? Or you're removing it because you think that they're never going to do it?" And those are three different, very different scenarios. And we have to think about that with a lot of the governance issues too. So it's a complicated picture, but I think that part of why we as IG professionals get engaged, especially on the outside, is that someone will help take the responsibility. I was going to say blame, and I don't quite mean that, but responsibility. Like the best of these engagements where I've worked on them have been some combination of outside counsel to do benchmarking and help guide the legal process along with implementation on a service provider side, working with a client. Paid to show up to get this stuff done. I swear it's some combination of the debt snowball where you're getting some things accomplished and you can show that progress along with a personal trainer. You show up, you encourage people to show up, people make commitments to doing that, and you do it for like some period of time. Hopefully it's like working with a psychiatrist or psychologist where you sign up, except there is an end date where you say, okay, now we're done. Like we fixed it. We fixed this issue. It's not going to be a lifetime obligation. We've moved through it. Although some of the other things, like it's clear that these relationships are going to be ongoing because we're not collecting less information. We're not developing less information. We're not maintaining less as time goes on. And we're seeing pressures down for storage costs, which then only seek to increase how much we're maintaining.
As AI becomes the norm, I think if we think that we're collecting and maintaining a lot of data, we're probably that's gonna explode exponentially with agentic AI, because of just the way we're able to connect and process and generate data. So, um, you know, uh, cars, what the type of data that they generated today to autonomous vehicles, the amount of data generated by autonomous vehicles, you could just see the amount of data that how it increased exponentially. And that's going to happen with pretty much everything. And so we're at an inflection point in terms of um, more data is necessary because that also kind of provides us insights to learn for AI agents to learn and correct and for us to understand how well things are performing. But at the same time, that means there's just more information about us and more detailed information about us, which can also kind of increase the risk. So finding the right balance between the usage of data as well as minimizing data when it's not needed. I think we're kind of it's been important before, but it's going to be more and more important that we get this right. So, do you have any other closing thoughts before we end the webinar?
For anybody watching that's not already in contact or that watches later on, please feel free to reach out and make connections with us on LinkedIn and to stay in that loop. Benchmarking is extraordinarily important within information governance. And that's, if we do like a future discussion, it'd be great to have people come on and ask questions or to find out what other organizations are doing. A lot of what I do is try to take logical approaches and say, here's what others are doing. Here's what's defensible. A lot of the routes that organizations are taking may not be objectively evident because so much of it's behind the proverbial firewall. I think that's part of what some of the orders that we've seen are trying to encourage, which is more information to data subjects about what organizations are doing. But even there, it's not a full arc of a data governance or even record retention program. We've seen some pressures. It'll be interesting to see if that's something that ends up with its own point of enforcement, which will be easier to then pitch to clients and say, you need to do this, not just because best practice, but also X organization was challenged here. But I mean, overall, yes, stay in contact. It's a community, especially for the data governance side. Reach out on LinkedIn, make those connections, and good luck.
Thank you so much for joining us, James. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. So thank you again.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.